Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Suleiman the Magnificent Part 6, Custodian of the Two Holy Mosques by Extra History. Now last time we saw is Suleiman killed two of his sons, another died, and then Roxolana, his love, died as well. So his personal life is sort of imploding around him, in part due to his own actions, and we are coming to the end of his life and the end of his reign as Sultan. We'll get to cover that in this episode. Each time Extra History does one of these series, they always end with a lies episode, where they cover anything they got wrong, anything they missed during the series. I react to that and make it a members-only exclusive. So if you'd like to check that out, I'll have it linked in the description and in the comments down below for channel members only. So thank you so much for supporting and for becoming a channel member if you'd like to check out that extra episode. You could also leave a like on the channel, subscribe, all that good stuff. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Sultan! Sultan! Someone was calling for him. It shook him from his reverie. There was a report for him. News from Malta.
Oh, interesting. So this whole series, we've had old Suleiman telling essentially the story of his life, and now we've made it to that moment. Now we get to deal with the older version of Suleiman we've been seeing this entire series.
He had outlived them all. That Spanish Prince Charles and his brother Ferdinand, Francis, King of France, all the Hungarian princes who had come and gone, but they had all been replaced by younger men. And here he remained.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's something to be said for outliving all your enemies. That's an achievement of some sort, but when your enemies die, their empires don't disappear. They just get taken over by someone else. And now you're this old man who's really lost a lot during his lifetime, perhaps not as capable as he once was, and you've got all these younger, fresher rivals on the scene. You know, perhaps not a great situation for you.
Very, very old. Philip, the Spanish prince that succeeded Charles, had used the wealth he had garnered from that far-off New World to rebuild a navy, and had declared himself the eternal enemy of all but the Catholic faith.
Yeah, I mean, this is when the Spanish are really reaching a peak of their power in the sort of mid-16th century, and they'll be pretty powerful for a while, right? This is a Spanish empire that is now pretty well entrenched in the Americas. They've established a presence, and they are bringing over boatloads and boatloads of silver and gold, right? They had these mines over in the Americas. You can think of Potosi, which is one of the famous Spanish mines over there, and they were using all this bullion, right, silver and gold they were bringing in to build up their state, build up their military, build up their navy in particular. And so Spain is really becoming very powerful. It's now probably, at this time, the most powerful of these European powers, though there's always competition for that top spot. That American gold and silver has made them very wealthy and militarily powerful as well.
For years, his ships had harried Ottoman fleets and contested their mastery of the Mediterranean. While his successes were limited, they emboldened other enemies of the port. And one old foe had grown too bold, the Knights of Malta. They had used their island in the center of the sea to serve as a safe harbor for Christian fleets looking to disrupt trade from North Africa. He closed his eyes. All of his old decisions seemed to haunt him, even those he'd thought were the best. When he had once so proudly cast the Knights Hospitaller out of their sanctuary on Rhodes, he had in his magnanimity let them live in peace and establish themselves on another island, further from his shores, Malta. These were the same knights he had defeated so long ago, back when all was glory and everything seemed possible. He smiled for a moment, remembering that mighty campaign. But now he was old and tired, and none of his friends were by his side. Instead of going himself, he had sent subordinates to deal with the threat. He sent 30,000 men and 200 ships to crush the Christian fastness in his sea. The knights had recalled all of their members from abroad, but still, his forces outnumbered them 3-1.
We'll see. I mean, look, Suleiman had all the power last time as well. 40 years prior, when they were fighting against the Knights of Rhodes, and they managed an impressive defense, but they did fall in the end. You've got a somewhat similar situation here, though it has been many decades. the powers of Christendom have strengthened, the Spanish in particular, and the Ottomans, I wouldn't say the Ottomans have weakened, but maybe have risen, maybe have plateaued a little bit, right? I'd say the European powers, once again, the Spanish and the Portuguese, but in this case, the Spanish, more importantly, have really been rising at a much faster pace than the Ottomans have, right? So perhaps the Ottomans geopolitically are not in as good a situation now as they were 40 years prior, but the Ottomans are still extremely powerful. They do still rule over, especially the Eastern Mediterranean. Really, there's not much competition for that, though there will be in the years to come. So, we'll see how this goes.
But this wasn't the disunified Europe that he
Right.
had faced in his youth.
Yeah.
While there were still great rifts in Christendom, his messengers had told him that a league had come together to reinforce the Knights of Malta.
Yeah, fair point, right? So, as I was sort of saying, Europe it's sort of on the uptick right now. Now, not to say there wasn't squabbling and wars and issues between the European powers. There was, as always, but you're dealing with a Europe that, once again, has been in power to a certain extent, particularly the Spanish and the Portuguese, and with a Europe that's maybe a little less of a mess than it was 40 years prior.
His ships were swift and at first took Europe by surprise, but not the Maltese knights. Though they hadn't expected him so early, they knew he would come. They had strengthened their mighty redoubts, shored up their walls, and stocked their larders. And when his men landed...
I do wonder, and we probably have sources which could tell us this, but I wonder if there were any old knights from Rhodes who were still alive at this point. I mean, it had been about 40 years, that's a long time, but I am curious if there was anybody who had lived through that siege of Rhodes, who was here at the siege of Malta. It seems possible.
The men of Malta all hid behind their walls. The land itself was his. Only the three great fortresses of St. Elmo, St. Angelo, and St. Michael defied him. But his command was split. His commander-in-chief was a man of 70, with less experience in military matters than matters political. The rest of his command were hardened veterans of the sea, privateers and admirals. There was constant conflict in command. As soon as the first contingent of his forces arrived at Malta, his commander-in-chief immediately had them disembark and begin sieging the small fort of St. Elmo. For 3 weeks they bombarded the fortress. The small garrison, some 400 strong, died to a man.
Wow.
But their valiant stand cost the Turks 3 weeks, and in the indignities that God now seemed to rain upon him, his best commander was killed in the useless siege by a fragment of loose stone. Meanwhile, reinforcements from Lombardy had made their way to the more formidable forts on the island. Filled with rage, his commander-in-chief had the corpses of those who had died defending St. Elmo nailed to boards and thrown under ramparts of the enemy fortresses, so they might see what became of those who resisted him. But the Grand Master of the Hospitallers ordered those Turks that had been thus far captured in the fighting executed, and their heads shot from cannons into the Ottoman camp. The fighting grew grim and ugly. The Ottoman plan seemed...
Yeah, I'm gonna say, 40 years ago against Rhodes, there was a lot of sort of gentlemanly behavior. Yes, of course, it's warfare, so how... I don't think warfare can ever really be that gentlemanly, you know what I mean? Some people feel differently, and of course that was warfare still at Rhodes. And even then, the Sultan, though he let a lot of them go in the end, I suppose showed a degree of mercy. That was him sort of making a threat in the beginning, like, hey, if you guys lay down your arms, I'll let you go. And eventually that's what happened. But just trying to make the point, this seems a lot more brutal. Definitely more brutal, more personal on both sides. Everybody knows the history. They remember what happened those decades ago. And the knights here appear to be ready to fight out until the very end.
to devolve down into an all-out assault, but in the blistering heat of mid-July, the men simply could not take the high walls of the Knights of Malta. By September, a large Christian fleet sailed for Malta, with supplies and a massive force to bolster the defense of the remaining strongholds. The Ottoman admirals were torn. They knew that if this fleet landed, the invasion was over. Victory would be impossible. They'd be left only with retreat. But what would happen if they fought this fleet and lost? There would be no retreat. There would not even be supplies. The entire invasion force would be lost.
Yeah, that would be disastrous, right? As I said earlier, the Ottomans have shown themselves to be the masters of the Mediterranean, the masters of the Eastern Mediterranean in particular. They've really taken over the Mediterranean. So, but if they lose here, that'd be a big problem. that would show them to be greatly, greatly weakened. That would definitely put a dent in that reputation, not to mention that would strand this invasion force. So the question is, do you want to square up to your enemies, fight them, and hopefully win, but you risk losing, which would really devastate everything? Or would you rather pull back, which is probably also not great for your reputation? Also, the whole point of this was to capture the island of Malta, but you do avoid the worst case scenario of your whole fleet being destroyed. Decisions, decisions.
Timidity won the day. And so, with staggering casualties and nothing to show for it, the once invincible force of the Empire had to withdraw. The note fell from his hand.
Yeah, I mean, look, once again, that's better than being defeated at sea there. That would have been a disaster. But this, I guess, was sort of a disaster of a lower level. Not quite a disaster, perhaps, but it certainly wasn't good for the Ottomans, right? They were forced to very publicly retreat from this assault on Malta. And this was one of those moments we talked about, the Siege of Vienna, where, honestly, the moment in the historical record sort of has been ballooned up to a much, more important moment than it really was. Not to say this wasn't important, but, the Europeans really rallied around this as a victory. They really felt like this was a big moment. The Knights of Malta and their European allies had stood up against the very powerful, scary Ottomans, and they had defeated them. And this was a sign that things were on the decline for the Ottomans, right? There's some truth there. There's also the fact that the Ottomans would remain very powerful for years and decades to follow this, right? So once again, no, it's not like, oh, this was the end for the Ottomans. That would be over-exaggerating it. But it is true that people at the time understood it to be an important moment. They probably felt it was more important than it really was, but just the fact that they believed that sort of made it an important moment at that time. Right? The Europeans felt this was a great victory. I'm sure Suleiman felt he had been humiliated in this instance. And so this is an example of what you see as you sort of head into the late 1500s through the 1600s, where the Ottomans, who had once appeared unstoppable, start taking these losses, right? At first, they're more sort of minor losses, and then they become more and more major over time, right? So it's this sort of stagnation, then eventually into the decline of the Ottomans versus the sort of rapid rise of the European powers. Now, once again, I don't want to overstate it. The Ottomans would be a powerful empire for decades to follow, but you do see this trend beginning.
He knew what this would mean, how the world would see it. The power and prestige, the empire that was a glory to all the world, these things would no longer be. His empire, which even the mightiest monarchs of Europe feared, would no longer be seen as some supernatural force.
Yes, and once again, this did not happen instantly. I don't want to over-exaggerate it, but it is representative of a larger and longer-term trend.
An all-powerful actor on the world stage, but simply as another nation. And here he was, forced to make the decision he knew he would have to make. The decision which had conjured in his mind thoughts of that old Roman emperor. A gamble. Does he accept this new and humble place for his empire, acting with the prudence that reason might perhaps dictate? Or does he embrace destiny as the master of the lands of Caesar and Alexander, and show the world his might by doing the one thing he had never been able to do?
And, I mean, it's funny because Justinian, who we keep talking about throughout this series, Justinian did the latter, right? Justinian was faced with that same question, as they pointed out. Do we just become another empire, or do we show that we are still the empire? Well, Justinian said, we are still the Romans. And he reconquered North Africa and reconquered Italy, reconquered a lot of Western Rome. But, of course, we know that that didn't last forever. And really, the second Justinian died, and even before then, the Byzantines were already struggling to hold on to those Western possessions and would slowly lose them over time. And, really, overall, the answer of the Byzantine Empire is that they would just be another empire. And you know what? That allowed them to survive for another 1,000 years. So if you're looking at the example of Justinian, maybe you say, well, Justinian didn't settle, neither will I. But when you look at Eastern Roman, Byzantine history more broadly, I think you could make the point that the only reason the Byzantines survived for as long as they did is that they were willing to be flexible, and they were willing to accept a sort of diminished role on the world stage, and that let them survive for, once again, 1,000 years after the fall of the West, right? So Suleiman's got this decision to make. You know, you can never truly say what the right answer is, but we'll see what he does.
He knew what that old Roman would do, and he knew what it had cost his empire.
Mm-hmm.
But he could not help but make the same choice.
Okay.
In the end, they were very much alike.
He goes the Justinian route. We're gonna take back everything. We are still the great empire. I gotta say, it doesn't usually work out well, but, you know, we'll see.
He would march on Vienna one last time. He would at last capture that capital of the Habsburgs and show the Christian world that rather than finally repelling the Ottoman Empire from Europe, they had merely parried one inconsequential thrust.
And I will say, I talked about in a previous episode how the Ottoman siege of Vienna was an important moment, but maybe has been somewhat overinflated. But I guess it's sort of similar to the situation with Malta, where people believed it was important in the moment, and that sort of made it more important than it really was. And it wasn't just the Europeans. You can see here, clearly the Ottomans believed it was important to take Vienna as well, because Suleiman has tried, failed, and now decades later is trying again. So it's clearly something that has stuck with him. It's clearly something that he values, right? You know, it's not something... We saw that when he failed to take Vienna that first time, you know, he basically, in the end, was like, oh, well, good campaign, who cares? And I said, nah, that's copium. It's clear this was a blow to him. And that's been made more clear by the fact that all these years later, he's still thinking about it, and he still wants to take Vienna. Will he have more success this time? I mean, you probably know the answer, but we'll watch it play out.
That the Ottoman juggernaut could not be stopped from rolling across all the lands of the world. He marshaled his forces, and for the first time in 10 years, planned to lead them himself. On the 1st of May, 1566, with the finest display the world had ever seen, his army departed the capital. It was good to be out of the city, away from the tombs and the memories, away from the politics. He only wished that he could ride, like in the olden days. He was too frail, too worn by the years, and too riddled with aches and pains to ride. Even in his carriage, every bump seared his gout-ridden joints. But still, he would not have them slow the army for him. Again, rain and bad weather plagued them. It reminded him of earlier times. How many times had nature herself opposed him? Should he have taken it as a sign?
Maybe.
As he crossed into Transylvania, the prince he had helped install there scattered jewels about his throne in reverence. This was what it meant to be Sultan. And yet the rain, always the rain. His army marched on. The
Maybe should have been taken as a sign.
rain fell. The ground swallowed cannon. Rivers carried away oxen whole. And yet they made it to Szeged, the first town they were to besiege. For a moment, he felt young again. He mounted a horse and ordered the cannonade. But then the weakness came back. He started to sweat. He asked a nearby aide to help him back to his tent. Time passed. He didn't know how much time. He just heard the ceaseless beating of the rain. He would fade in and out of awareness. Sometimes he would wake and there would be faces bending over him. Sometimes he would be alone, except for his guards. The rain beat down. It was after sunset. The light in the tent was dim, and Ibrahim sat in a chair next to him.
Uh-oh.
He put a hand on
I think we could see this attempt to to take Vienna. It's not going great.
his shoulder. Ibrahim
My man is seeing ghosts now.
smiled at him. I know you're frightened, but there was never anything we couldn't accomplish together.
Hey man, I mean, I know this is all imaginary here, but if I was Ibrahim, I'd be like, why'd you kill me, motherfucker? What the hell? We were homies. I was loyal to you, and you killed me? That's what I would say, but maybe I'm more petty than he was.
Felt an ache in his chest. He had something he had to tell Ibrahim, something to apologize for, but he couldn't quite remember. He hoped they'd go hawking tomorrow, if only it didn't rain. His eyes opened. Everything was a sort of haze, everything except the handsome face of Mustafa. He was glad to see him. The boy was hard to get along with sometimes, but he was a fine man and he would make a great sultan. Perhaps even a better one than he had.
Maybe so. Maybe he would have. I mean, better than Suleiman, probably not. But, well, okay, it's a counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened if Suleiman hadn't killed his eldest son. But I think there's a good chance he would have been a good sultan. Probably better than the sultan we actually got, right? which is, I mean, along with just the cruelty of having your own son executed, it's a real shame for the Empire that they missed out on what I think could have been a pretty great sultan, though you never really know.
Proud to have such a son. He wanted to give the boy his sword. Where'd he put it?
Uh-oh.
No, that wasn't it. Something else. Something he wanted to say to him. He hoped he'd be kind to his brothers.
Uh-oh.
He drifted off again to the sound of rain on the pavilion. He woke, and it was dark. Roxolana was sitting at the foot of his bed. She was like she was in his youth. He tried to reach for her, and she put a finger to her lips. Shh, 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 shh. Rest now, you're almost done. No one can fault you for things you've done for love. His eyes closed.
I'll fault him. This is quite a dramatization, by the way, of the end.
Rain and time. He vaguely wondered what happened to the fortress outside. Then he
Nothing.
closed his eyes.
Wow, okay, that's the end of the series, huh? Interesting way to end it. I wish we would have talked a bit more about what actually happened, the aftermath. Of course, the Ottomans, I mean, Suleiman didn't even really get a chance to siege Vienna. As we've talked about before, the Ottomans will besiege Vienna again about a little more than 100 years later, 100 years after this, and they will fail there again. The Ottomans never managed to take Vienna, which was a big sore point for the Ottomans and a big point of celebration for the Europeans, right? But we see here Suleiman's life ends, and, things don't end so well for him. I will say, I mean, Suleiman was this great sultan. We saw his achievements throughout the series. You don't want to downplay those things. Personally, things went sort of wrong for him with Ibrahim and the multiple sons he killed and Roxolana and all this type of stuff. And it does seem to me he did become more sort of paranoid, suspicious, and angry as he aged, which often happens with the kings and emperors like this. And that, Malta was a bit of an embarrassment, and of course he doesn't take Vienna at the end. So not a great end for Suleiman. And of course, after his death, I mean, it's not like the decline of the Ottoman Empire begins then. I mean, Selim II was not a great sultan, but even under him, the Ottomans still had great achievements, and the empire, it was sort of, I guess you could say it was kind of stagnant, but there was still some expansion, and it was still a very powerful empire. When you're that powerful, even being stagnant is still impressive. But what we do see over the next couple of decades is the beginning of the long Ottoman decline, right? Which then leads to centuries of Ottoman decline. And of course, for a long time, the empire would be very weakened, the sick man of Europe. But you don't see that under Suleiman. You see a very powerful, skilled emperor who certainly made some mistakes, personal and political, but who achieved a lot during his reign. So there we go. We have the life and career of Suleiman the Magnificent. If you guys enjoyed this one, you could leave a like, subscribe, and if you'd like to see my reaction to Extra History's Lies series, Lies episode, you can become a YouTube channel member. I'll have that linked in the description and in the comments down below. Thank you for watching, everybody. I hope you guys all have a fantastic day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.